The night hummed with an electric stillness, a strange kind of quiet that only seemed to exist in the depth of summer. Sarah sat on the porch, legs curled beneath her on the old wicker chair, her bare feet poking out from under her cotton dress. The air was thick, almost alive, clinging to her skin like a second layer. It was the kind of night that pressed against you, a velvet weight urging you to slow down and feel each breath, each heartbeat. She glanced up at the sky, her eyes tracing constellations she had once known by name. As a child, her father had taught her the stories of the stars, the myths of gods and heroes who danced above them. He would point to the sky, and she would follow his finger, her imagination painting pictures of warriors and lovers, of battles fought and sacrifices made. It had been years since she had thought about those nights, years since she had looked up and felt the universe shift around her. But tonight, something felt different. There was an unease in the air, a tension that curled around her chest like an invisible thread. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, refusing to be ignored. The letter lay beside her on the bench, edges crinkled from where she had gripped it too tightly earlier. She had found it in her mailbox that morning, nestled between bills and advertisements, its envelope worn as if it had traveled a long way to reach her. The handwriting was unmistakable. Long, looping letters she had seen countless times scrawled across notes passed in high school, on postcards sent during college vacations. Peter. The name alone brought back a rush of memories, some sweet, some bitter, all vivid in a way she had long tried to forget. He had been her everything once, the boy with the easy smile and restless eyes, the one who had made her feel like the world was full of possibilities. But he had also been the one who left, without a word, without a reason, just gone, like a gust of wind on a summer night, leaving only questions in his wake. Sarah picked up the letter again, her fingers brushing over the ink. There was nothing poetic about it, just a few simple lines, the handwriting a bit shaky, as if he had hesitated before each word. He wanted to meet her. Tomorrow evening, at the pier. No explanation, no apologies. She had read the letter over and over throughout the day, each time feeling something different. Anger, confusion, curiosity. She wanted to crumple it up, toss it into the fireplace, and forget it ever existed. But she also wanted to know, wanted to hear what he had to say after all these years, wanted to see the face that had haunted her dreams for far too long. Why now? She muttered under her breath, the words swallowed by the warm night. She closed her eyes, leaning back in the chair, letting the gentle creak of the porch settle her. She could almost hear Peter's laughter, the way it used to fill up all the empty spaces between them. The way it made her feel like she was the only person in the world that mattered. The crickets droned on, their song an indifferent witness to her turmoil. She wondered what he had been doing all these years. Had he thought about her? Had he regretted leaving? Or was she just a blip on his radar, something to revisit out of convenience, or worse, guilt? 1,000 questions crowded her mind, each one heavier than the last. She remembered the last time she saw him, standing at the edge of her driveway, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders slouched as if he was carrying something too heavy for his frame. He had said he needed time, that he was restless, that he wanted to see the world beyond their small town. She had believed him, had even encouraged him to go, thinking he would come back. But weeks turned into months, months into years, and the only thing that returned was silence. The scars from his departure had never quite healed. They had scabbed over, sure, but beneath the surface there was still pain, still a rawness that flared up whenever she allowed herself to remember. And now, with just a few words, he had brought it all back. Sarah let out a deep sigh, the weight of the letter heavy in her lap. Tomorrow she would see him. She wondered what she would say, whether she would be able to contain her anger, her grief, whether she would demand answers or just let him talk. Suddenly, a light breeze swept through the porch, lifting the loose tendrils of her hair and sending a shiver down her spine. She looked up at the sky again. It was beautiful tonight, clear, the stars bright and sharp against the dark canvas of the universe. For a moment, she thought she could almost see them shifting, realigning, as if to mark the change that was about to come. It was foolish, she knew, to hope for closure, to think that one conversation could make sense of all the pain he had caused. But something inside her was stirring. A tiny flicker of hope, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, this was what she needed to finally move on. She picked up the letter once more, folding it carefully before slipping it into the pocket of her dress. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it. She would face Peter, face the memories, face the past that she had spent so long trying to bury. And maybe in doing so, she could finally lay it all to rest. The stars above seemed to twinkle, a knowing glimmer that made her smile despite herself. Maybe the universe knew something she didn't. Maybe the night was shifting because something was finally about to change. Sarah stood, her bare feet pressing against the cool wood of the porch, and looked out into the darkness. Tomorrow, she thought, let the stars shift as they will. She would be ready. The pier stretched out before Sarah, its wooden planks creaking under her slow, deliberate steps. She could see the end of it now, silhouetted against the fiery glow of the setting sun. The sky was a masterpiece of gold and purple, as if someone had spilled paint across the horizon and let it bleed into the twilight. It was the kind of beauty that usually made her stop and breathe it all in. But tonight, her chest felt tight, her breath shallow, her mind a maze of half-formed questions and fears. The waves lapped against the weathered pylons below, the rhythmic sound filling the quiet that hung between each of her steps. She hadn't been to the pier in years, since before Peter left, really. It used to be their spot. She and Peter would sneak down here in the dead of night, armed with a bottle of cheap wine they had swiped from his father's cellar, and talk about the future as they stared out into the endless black of the ocean. She remembered the nights they spent lying side by side, their fingers intertwined, the stars reflecting in the water below as they spoke of dreams they were too young to understand. But tonight, the pier felt like an alien place, haunted by echoes of a past she had tried to forget. The closer she got, the more she could see Peter's figure standing at the edge, facing the water, his outline wavering like a mirage in the thick summer air. The sight of him there, in the same spot they used to occupy together, made her heart skip a beat. The memories rushed in, unwanted and uninvited, reminding her of what they had lost. She stopped a few feet away, her stomach a tight knot of nerves. For a moment, she considered turning back, walking away before he even knew she was there. But the urge to face him, to confront whatever it was he had come back for, kept her feet planted. Peter turned, as if sensing her presence, his face catching the last light of the dying sun. He looked older now, his features sharper, the boyish softness she remembered replaced by the hard lines of someone who had seen too much. He gave her a half smile, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure how she would respond. "Sarah," he said, her name slipping from his lips with a familiarity that stung. He said it softly, almost reverently, as if it were a prayer. "Peter," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. She took a step closer, her eyes locked on his, searching for answers before either of them had even spoken. "You look good," Peter said, the corners of his mouth tugging upwards in a tentative smile. "Better than I expected." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her arms folding defensively across her chest. "That's an odd way to start a conversation, especially after 15 years. He chuckled, the sound hollow, as if he knew how much he had messed up, but didn't know how to begin to make it right. "Yeah, I suppose it is." Silence settled between them, filled with the sound of waves and the creak of the old pier as it rocked gently with the tide. Sarah could feel the weight of all the things unsaid, the ghosts of their shared past hovering between them like an invisible wall. She wasn't sure she wanted to tear it down. Not yet. Not until she knew why he had come back. "What do you want, Peter?" she asked, her voice firmer now, demanding. She wasn't here for small talk or pleasantries. She wanted the truth, raw and real, no matter how much it hurt. Peter hesitated, his gaze drifting away from her to look out over the water. For a long moment, it seemed like he wasn't going to answer. His jaw clenched, the muscles shifting beneath his skin as he fought to find the words. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, heavy with regret. "I need to tell you why I left," he said, his eyes still fixed on the horizon, as if he couldn't bear to look at her. Sarah's heart skipped, her breath catching in her throat. She had imagined this moment so many times, had dreamed of it, dreaded it. And now, here it was, but she didn't feel ready. She wasn't sure if she would ever be ready to hear the truth. She swallowed, her voice a whisper when she finally spoke. "Then tell me." Peter took a deep breath, his eyes closing for a moment before he turned to face her, the intensity of his gaze catching her off guard. He took a step closer, his hands still in his pockets, but his posture changed, less guarded, more vulnerable. "I left because I found something I wasn't supposed to. Something that scared the hell out of me," he began, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. He hesitated, his gaze flickering away for a moment before he forced himself to meet her eyes again. "It was about your grandmother." Sarah blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "My grandmother?" she repeated, her mind struggling to make sense of the words. Peter nodded. "I was in your attic, remember? Helping your mom clear out some of the old stuff she wanted to donate. That's when I found them, the letters. Love letters written by your grandmother to a man named William." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts swirling. Her grandmother had always been a mystery to her. Stern, proper, the kind of woman who never showed emotion. She couldn't picture her writing love letters, couldn't picture her being in love with anyone but her grandfather. Peter paused, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for a sign that she was ready for what came next. It wasn't just that she was in love with someone else. There was more, Sarah. The letters, they talked about things that happened the summer William disappeared. The air seemed to shift around them. The warmth suddenly replaced by a chill that made Sarah shiver. She remembered the stories her mother used to tell her, the whispers of her grandmother's old love, the man who had vanished without a trace. No one had ever talked about it in detail, and her grandmother had always changed the subject whenever it came up. Sarah stared at Peter, her pulse racing. What happened to him? Peter's gaze was steady now, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't an accident, Sarah. Your grandmother, she was involved. There was something dark in those letters, something that made me realize I couldn't stay. I was scared, for you, for myself. I knew if I stayed, I'd end up digging deeper, and I was afraid of what I'd find." Sarah felt a cold weight settle in her chest, her mind spinning. She could barely comprehend what Peter was saying, the words crashing over her like a wave, pulling her under. Her grandmother, the woman who had always been a pillar of strength, who had raised her when her parents were too busy, was she capable of something so terrible? "You just left," Sarah said, her voice trembling, anger bubbling beneath her confusion. "You didn't say anything, didn't even try to explain. You just left me with all those questions." Peter's eyes filled with regret, his expression pained. He took another step closer, his hand almost reaching out before he pulled it back, as if afraid to touch her. "I know, I was a coward, Sarah. I should have stayed. I should have told you the truth back then. But I'm here now, and I want to help you figure it out. I owe you that much." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes as she struggled to keep herself together. The stars above seemed to swirl, the pier shifting beneath her feet as if the ground was no longer solid. She had come here for closure, for answers, but all she had found were more questions, deeper, darker than she could have imagined. Peter's voice was soft, almost pleading. "I never stopped thinking about you, Sarah. Not once. And I know it's too late, that I can't undo the hurt I caused. But I'm here now. Please, let me help you." Sarah looked at him, at the earnestness in his eyes, the regret that seemed to weigh him down. She wanted to hate him, wanted to turn away and leave him standing alone on that pier, just like he had left her. But the truth was, she needed him. She needed the answers he had, needed to understand the past that had haunted both of them. Slowly, she nodded, her heart pounding as she took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Okay, Peter, let's find out the truth together." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and the promise of rain, the first distant rumble of thunder echoing across the water. And as they stood there, side by side, staring out at the darkening ocean, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The stars above seemed to realign, as if the universe itself was marking this moment, the night when everything changed. The attic was exactly as Sarah remembered it, dark, dusty, and filled with the weight of forgotten years. The wooden stairs creaked beneath her feet, each groan a reminder that this place had remained untouched for far too long. She climbed slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the dimness as she made her way up, the air growing colder and mustier with each step. The door to the attic resisted her push, as if the house itself was trying to keep her away from whatever lay inside. With a grunt, she shoved it open, the hinges protesting loudly before it finally gave way, revealing the space beyond. She paused at the threshold, her flashlight flickering, casting long shadows against the sloped ceiling. A shiver ran down her spine, a mixture of anticipation and dread. It had been years since she had last ventured up here. She could remember her grandmother scolding her as a child for snooping in the attic, forbidding her from exploring what was meant to stay buried. Back then, she had chalked it up to old family heirlooms and dusty antiques, but now, with Peter's words echoing in her mind, she realized it had been so much more. Sarah stepped inside, her feet crunching on the layer of dust that blanketed the floor. The attic was filled with a clutter of forgotten belongings, old trunks, mismatched chairs, and boxes piled high. Everything was covered in dust cloths, making the scene look almost ghostly, like an old memory half forgotten. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and age, as if time itself had settled here. She took a deep breath, willing herself to move forward. Somewhere in this attic lay the truth, a truth that had scared Peter enough to make him leave without a word, a truth that had haunted her grandmother to her grave. Sarah's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating an old rocking chair, its once bright cushions now stained and torn. She paused for a moment, her gaze lingering on it. She could almost picture her grandmother sitting there, her face stern, her hands knitting something for winter. But there was no warmth in those memories tonight, only the lingering question. What was her grandmother hiding? In the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by an old quilt, Sarah saw it. The chest. A small, nondescript wooden chest with a tarnished brass latch, something that could easily be overlooked amid the clutter. Her heart skipped a beat, a strange sense of recognition flooding her. This was it. She knew it without needing to be told. This was what Peter had found. She crossed the room, her footsteps careful as the floor creaked under her weight. Kneeling in front of the chest, she hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the latch. There was a part of her that wanted to walk away, to leave whatever secrets were hidden here buried in the past where they belonged. But she couldn't, not after everything Peter had told her. With a shaky breath, she undid the latch, the sound loud in the stillness of the attic. The lid lifted easily, revealing a collection of letters inside. Each one yellowed with age, the edges frayed and fragile. Sarah swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her ears as she reached for the topmost letter. Her grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, looping cursive, written with the care of someone who had once taken pride in the art of letter writing. She unfolded the letter carefully, her fingers trembling as she began to read. "My dearest William," it began, the words written with a tenderness that caught Sarah off guard. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice, soft and wistful, speaking the words aloud. The letter spoke of love, of stolen moments beneath the summer sky, of dreams shared in whispers. It was beautiful, passionate, filled with a longing that Sarah had never imagined her grandmother capable of. But as she read further, the tone shifted, darkened. "I fear we are running out of time. They are growing suspicious. I don't know how much longer we can keep this a secret. If anything happens, I want you to know that I will never regret a single moment we shared, even if it brings ruin to us both." Sarah's breath caught, her heart hammering in her chest. The words seemed to leap off the page, each one heavier than the last. Suspicion, secrets, ruin. She read on, her eyes scanning the rest of the letter, but it ended abruptly, as if the rest had been lost or intentionally destroyed. She reached for another letter, then another, the story unfolding before her like a puzzle missing half its pieces. Her grandmother and William had been in love. Deeply, desperately, the kind of love that defied rules and expectations. But there was more. There were hints of something sinister, of someone watching them, of danger that lurked just out of sight. Sarah's fingers brushed against the bottom of the chest, her flashlight beam catching something metallic, a small tarnished locket. She picked it up, turning it over in her hand. It was simple, delicate, the kind of thing that would have been a cherished keepsake. She pried it open, her breath hitching as she saw the tiny black and white photo inside. Her grandmother, much younger, smiling at the camera, and beside her, a man. William. His face was handsome, his eyes bright, filled with a kind of happiness that seemed almost out of place now that she knew what had happened. She stared at the photo, her mind racing with questions. What had happened to him? What had her grandmother done? Suddenly, a noise from downstairs broke the silence. A creak, like a footstep on the stairs. Sarah froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She turned off the flashlight, plunging the attic into darkness, her ears strained to catch any sound. She held her breath, her pulse thundering in her ears. Another creak. Someone was definitely there. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her hand gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The darkness seemed to press in on her, her senses heightened, every creak and groan of the old house amplified in the silence. She took a step back, her eyes fixed on the attic door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. "Sarah?" A voice called out, low and urgent. Her body tensed, and for a moment she couldn't place it, until recognition hit her like a cold wave. "Peter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The attic door creaked open, and Peter's face appeared in the dim light. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a flare of anger. She lowered the flashlight, her grip tightening as she glared at him. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice sharp, her emotions a tangled mess of fear, anger, and confusion. Peter stepped into the attic, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone, or something, else to be there. "I had to come. I couldn't let you do this alone." Sarah shook her head, her frustration bubbling over. "You scared the hell out of me." She took a step toward him, her chest heaving. "I was starting to think." He held up his hands in surrender, his eyes softening. "I'm sorry, okay? I had this feeling, like something wasn't right." She paused, her anger fading slightly as she looked at him, really looked at him. His face was drawn, his eyes filled with a kind of fear that mirrored her own. He wasn't just here for her, he was scared too. Scared of whatever they were about to uncover. Sarah let out a shaky breath, nodding toward the chest. "I found the letters. They're worse than I imagined, Peter. There's something here, something dark." Peter stepped closer, his eyes flicking to the open chest, the scattered letters. He knelt beside it, picking up one of the letters, his brow furrowing as he read. "This is why I left, Sarah. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to protect you from this." Sarah swallowed, her throat tight. She knelt beside him, her hand resting on the edge of the chest. "We're going to figure it out. Together." Peter looked at her, his expression softening, a flicker of something, hope, in his eyes. He nodded, his hand brushing against hers, a silent promise between them. "Together," he echoed. The air in the attic felt different now, less oppressive, as if the weight of the secrets they had uncovered had shifted, making room for something else. Something like hope, like the possibility that maybe they could face whatever lay ahead. But as they sat there, the darkness pressing in around them, Sarah knew one thing for certain. The past was not going to let go without a fight. The sun was setting as Sarah stood in the attic, staring down at the letters spread out before her. Her mind was racing, struggling to piece together the fragments of the story her grandmother had left behind. The air in the attic was stifling, thick with dust and secrets, and each breath seemed to lodge in her chest, making her feel like she was inhaling the weight of a forgotten past. Peter was beside her, his face drawn and tense as he sifted through the letters. His fingers moved carefully over the fragile pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. They had been up here for hours, the daylight slowly slipping away, leaving them in a cocoon of shadows and whispers. "Look at this one," Peter said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. He held up a letter, the paper thin and yellowed, as if it might crumble in his hands. Sarah leaned over, her eyes scanning the words, her heart pounding. "July 15th, 1963. My dearest William," it began. The date struck her immediately. This was written just days before William disappeared. The words were filled with desperation, a sense of urgency that hadn't been in the previous letters. Her grandmother spoke of someone following them, of her fear that they were being watched. There were references to a shadow that seemed to be everywhere they went, a constant presence that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. As she read on, her breath caught. Her grandmother wrote of a night they had planned, a rendezvous at the cliffs. The same cliffs that everyone in town knew as the place where William had supposedly slipped and fallen to his death. Sarah looked up at Peter, her eyes wide. She knew something was going to happen. She whispered, her voice shaking. She was scared. She knew someone was after them. Peter nodded, his jaw tight. I think she might have been trying to run. Maybe that night they were planning to leave town. Sarah's heart twisted at the thought. Her grandmother had been planning to run away, to leave everything behind for love, but she never made it. William had died, and her grandmother had stayed, haunted by the weight of her secret. It was a love story turned tragedy, but it felt like there was more, something darker lurking beneath the surface. Sarah gathered the letters, stacking them carefully before placing them back in the chest. She took the locket and slipped it into her pocket, feeling the cold metal against her fingertips. She turned to Peter, her eyes searching his. We need to find out who is following them. Someone knew about their affair, and they did everything they could to stop it. Peter nodded, his eyes filled with determination. There has to be more. Maybe someone in town remembers something. Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the attic window. The sky outside had darkened, the first stars appearing in the twilight. There was a sense of inevitability now, as if they were on the brink of something that had been waiting for years to be uncovered. A ghost from the past, ready to be called forth. The next day, Sarah and Peter stood outside the old library, the sun beating down on them, casting long shadows across the steps. The library was one of the oldest buildings in town, its brick facade weathered and worn, the windows clouded with age. It was the kind of place that held memories, the kind that refused to be forgotten. Peter opened the door, and they stepped inside, the air cool and still, the smell of old books and polished wood filling the space. The librarian, Mrs. Thompson, looked up from her desk, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She was in her 70s, her hair a soft silver, and Sarah remembered her from her childhood. Always kind, always with a book recommendation for a curious young girl. Hello, Mrs. Thompson, Sarah said, her voice soft. I was wondering if you could help us with something. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Of course, dear. What is it? Sarah hesitated, glancing at Peter before turning back to the librarian. I was wondering if you remember anything about my grandmother, Mary. Specifically, about a man named William. He disappeared back in the 60s. The smile faded from Mrs. Thompson's face, replaced by a look of surprise. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze sharpening. Mary and William, she said slowly, as if tasting the words. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. We found some letters. They mentioned someone following them, watching them. We think there might have been more to William's death than just an accident. Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted, a shadow crossing her face. She glanced around the library, as if making sure they were alone, before leaning forward, her voice low. There were rumors, you know. Back then, people talked. They said William didn't just fall. That someone might have been involved. Sarah's pulse quickened. Who? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. No one knew for sure. But there were whispers about Mary's husband, your grandfather, George. People said he might have found out about the affair, that he wasn't happy. He was a proud man, you know. He wouldn't have taken kindly to his wife running around with another man. Sarah's stomach turned, a cold dread settling over her. Her grandfather had always been a stern figure in her life, a man of few words who commanded respect. She had never imagined him capable of something like this, something so dark, so final. Peter stepped forward, his eyes locked on Mrs. Thompson. Is there anyone else who might know more? Anyone who was close to them at the time? Mrs. Thompson thought for a moment, then nodded. There's one person, Eleanor Wilson. She was Mary's best friend back then. If anyone knew what was really going on, it would be her. Sarah felt a surge of hope, her heart racing. Where can we find her? Mrs. Thompson smiled, a sad sort of smile. She lives out by the edge of town, in that old farmhouse. Be careful, though. She's not as sharp as she used to be. Time has a way of blurring things. Sarah nodded, her mind already racing ahead. Eleanor Wilson. Someone who might have the answers they needed. Someone who could finally shed light on the darkness that had haunted her family for decades. The farmhouse was surrounded by fields, the grass swaying gently in the breeze, the sun casting long shadows across the dirt path that led to the front door. The house itself was old, its paint peeling, the porch sagging, but there was something comforting about it, something that spoke of years of laughter and life. Sarah knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Peter stood beside her, his expression serious, his eyes scanning the fields as if expecting something to appear out of the shadows. The door creaked open, and an elderly woman peered out, her eyes sharp despite her age. Her hair was white, pulled back in a loose bun, and her hands were knotted with arthritis. She looked at Sarah, her gaze narrowing. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice wary. Sarah took a deep breath. "My name is Sarah. I'm Mary's granddaughter. I was hoping you could help us. We're trying to understand what happened to William." Eleanor's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Mary's granddaughter," she said, her voice softening. "Come in." The inside of the house was cluttered but warm, filled with the scent of lavender and old wood. Eleanor led them to the living room, gesturing for them to sit. She settled into a rocking chair, her gaze never leaving Sarah's face. "You look just like her," she said, her voice wistful. Mary was a beautiful girl, so full of life. Sarah swallowed, her throat tight. "I found her letters, Eleanor, the ones she wrote to William. We think someone was following them. That someone might have hurt him." Eleanor's face darkened, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "Mary was in love with William," she said, her voice trembling. "They were planning to run away, but someone found out, someone who didn't want them to leave." Sarah's heart pounded. Was it my grandfather? Eleanor looked at her, her eyes filled with sadness. George was a proud man. He loved Mary, but his love was possessive, controlling. He found out about William, and he confronted them at the cliffs. There was a struggle, and William fell. Mary never forgave herself. She blamed herself for what happened. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, her chest tight with grief. Her grandmother had lived her life carrying the weight of that night, the guilt of what had happened. And her grandfather, he had taken the love of her grandmother's life, leaving only pain behind. Peter reached over, his hand covering hers, his touch grounding her. She looked at him, her eyes filled with questions, with fear. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Peter's eyes were steady, his expression determined. "We tell the truth, Sarah. We let the ghosts of summer finally rest." The summer air was thick as they left. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in deep purples and blues. As Sarah sat in the attic, her legs crossed beneath her, the letters scattered around her like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Each page was a fragment of a love she had never known her grandmother was capable of, and each line was heavy with secrets that had been buried for decades. The truth had begun to take shape, but it still felt fragile, like glass that could shatter at the slightest touch. The discovery at Eleanor's farmhouse had left her shaken. The story of her grandfather, George, confronting her grandmother and William at the cliffs had changed everything. The image of George, the stern, emotionless figure who had loomed over her childhood, had twisted into something darker, something that frightened her. She could almost see him now, his eyes blazing with fury, his hands clenched in anger as he faced William that night. It made her chest ache, a painful mixture of fear and sorrow. Peter was downstairs, combing through the family records they'd found in the old study, but Sarah felt the need to be alone for a while, to process everything that had been unraveled. She leaned back against the attic wall, her fingers brushing over the worn edges of one of the letters, her mind drifting to that fateful night at the cliffs. She could almost hear the waves crashing against the rocks, almost feel the desperation that must have hung in the air as love turned to tragedy. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps on the stairs jolted her back to the present. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat, as the door to the attic opened, and Peter's head appeared in the dim light. "Sarah?" he called softly, his eyes scanning the attic until they landed on her. He climbed the last few steps, his expression a mix of urgency and concern. "You need to see this." Sarah stood, her heart thudding in her chest as she followed him down the narrow stairs and into the study. The air was cooler here, a draft coming in through the cracked window, making the curtains sway gently. Peter led her to the desk, where an old ledger lay open, the yellowed pages filled with meticulous handwriting. He pointed to a particular entry, his face tense. "Look at this," he said, his voice low. "It's a list of debts. Your grandfather's debts." Sarah leaned in, her eyes scanning the page. Her grandfather had owed money to several people in town, large sums, it seemed. The entries were detailed, each debt marked with dates and names. And there, towards the bottom of the page, was a name she recognized: Jonathan Keller. Jonathan Keller had been a prominent figure in the town, the kind of man who always seemed to have his hand in everyone else's business. He was wealthy, influential, and as far back as she could remember, people had spoken of him with a mix of respect and fear. If her grandfather had owed money to Keller, that meant something far more sinister was at play. "What does this mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter looked at her, his jaw clenched. "I think your grandfather wasn't acting alone that night. I think Jonathan Keller was involved. Maybe George went to Keller for help, maybe to stop Mary and William from leaving, or maybe to protect his own pride." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The idea that Keller, a man whose power stretched like a shadow over the town, had been involved in William's death made everything feel darker, more dangerous. She reached for one of the old letters, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked it up. "Peter, if Keller was involved, this could be more than just a jealous confrontation," she said, her voice shaking. "It could be a cover-up, an entire web of lies spun to protect their secrets." Peter nodded, his eyes dark. "It makes sense. Think about it. No one ever questioned William's disappearance. The town just accepted it as an accident. Maybe Keller used his influence to make sure no one asked any questions. He could have orchestrated the whole thing." Sarah swallowed hard, her mouth dry as her mind raced. She felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, like everything she thought she knew was crumbling away, leaving only shadows and uncertainty. Her grandmother had lived her entire life haunted by what happened, burdened by a guilt that wasn't just about love. It was about secrets, threats, and powerful men who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Suddenly, Peter's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He pulled it out of his pocket, his eyes narrowing at the screen. He glanced at Sarah, his expression shifting to one of concern. "It's Eleanor. She's been trying to reach us." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What does she want? Peter read the message, his brow furrowing. "She says we need to come back. That there's something else we need to see." She sounds scared. A knot formed in Sarah's stomach. The air seemed to grow colder, and a sense of dread settled over her. Eleanor had already told them so much. What else could she possibly have to reveal? "Let's go," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. She grabbed the locket from the desk, slipping it into her pocket. Whatever Eleanor had to show them, she needed to see it. She needed to understand the full story, no matter how dark or twisted it might be. The drive to Eleanor's farmhouse felt longer this time, the road winding through fields that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the night sky. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, and the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust kicked up by the car. Sarah's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her mind racing with possibilities. What had frightened Eleanor enough to call them back? Peter parked in front of the farmhouse, the tires crunching on the gravel. The house was dark, the windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. Sarah could feel her heart pounding, her breath quickening as she stepped out of the car, the night air cool against her skin. They approached the door, and Peter knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, And they waited, the silence stretching out until it became almost unbearable. "Eleanor?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. There was a sound, a shuffle from inside, like something being dragged across the floor. Peter exchanged a glance with Sarah, his eyes wide, and he tried the doorknob. It turned, and the door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. "Stay behind me," Peter whispered, his voice barely audible. He stepped inside, and Sarah followed, her heart hammering in her chest. The house was silent except for the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. They moved down the hallway, the shadows deep and thick around them, until they reached the living room. The sight that greeted them made Sarah gasp. Eleanor was there, slumped in her rocking chair, her eyes closed, her face pale. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah thought she was dead, but then she saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Eleanor's hand was resting on the armrest, her fingers curled around a piece of paper. Peter rushed forward, kneeling beside her, his fingers pressing gently against her neck. "She's alive," he said, relief in his voice. He reached for the paper, carefully prying it from her fingers. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the page. It was a note, the handwriting shaky and hurried. "They're watching. They don't want the truth to come out. You have to finish what I couldn't. The key is in the shed." Sarah's blood ran cold. They were being watched. Someone, maybe Keller, maybe someone else, knew they were digging into the past, and they were trying to stop them. Peter looked up at her, his eyes wide. "The shed. We need to go." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She looked at Eleanor, her heart aching for the woman who had tried to help them, who had risked so much to tell the truth. She reached down, squeezing Eleanor's hand gently. "We'll finish this, I promise." The shed stood at the edge of the property, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. The door was old, the wood warped, and Peter had to shove hard to get it open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the door swung wide, revealing the darkness inside. Sarah stepped in first, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The shed was cluttered, filled with gardening tools, old boxes, and cobwebs. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning the space, until her beam landed on something unusual, a metal box, half hidden beneath an old tarp. She knelt down, pulling the tarp aside, her fingers brushing over the cold metal. The box was locked, but the latch was rusty. Peter knelt beside her, and with a quick motion, he broke the lock, the rusted metal snapping easily. Sarah lifted the lid, her breath catching in her throat as she saw what was inside. Documents, old photographs, letters, evidence. Evidence of what had really happened that night at the cliffs. There were photographs of her grandmother and William, taken from a distance as if they had been followed. There were letters from her grandfather to Keller, pleading for help, offering money. And there, at the bottom of the box, was a small black notebook. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling as she opened it. The pages were filled with George's handwriting, notes, plans, details of his meetings with Keller. He had planned it all. The confrontation, the threats. And Keller had helped him cover it up, had used his influence to ensure that no one would ever question the story of William's accidental death. Sarah felt a sob rise in her throat, her vision blurring with tears. Her grandfather had orchestrated it all, had taken the love of her grandmother's life and destroyed it, all to protect his pride, his reputation. Peter placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. "We have what we need now, Sarah. The truth. We can bring this to light." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy. The truth was a weight, but it was also a release. A way to finally set her grandmother free from the ghosts that had haunted her for so long. She stood, the notebook clutched in her hand, and looked out at the darkened fields beyond the shed. The night was still, the air cool, and for the first time she felt a sense of calm. The unraveling was complete. The truth was out. And now it was time to let the ghosts rest.